There is a number sitting underneath the entire financial world. Not inflation, not interest rates, not the debt ceiling. One number, a ratio, and almost nobody talks about it in plain language because when you do, it starts to sound a little insane. Here it is. For roughly every $1 that actually exists in the system, $10 are in circulation, being lent, borrowed, spent, and counted as real. 10 to 1. That is not a conspiracy. That is not a metaphor. That is more or less how the machine runs. And once you understand it, you will never look at your bank account the same way again. Let's start somewhere uncomfortable. When you deposit $1,000 into your bank, you probably picture it sitting in a vault somewhere, maybe in a neat little stack. Your money, waiting, safe. It is not there the moment that deposit hits your account. The bank is already legally allowed to lend out the majority of it. In the United States, before 2020, banks were required to keep roughly 10% in reserve, 10 cents on every dollar. The rest? Gone, out the door, turned into someone else's mortgage, car loan, credit card balance, or business loan. And here is where it gets strange. When that person deposits their loan into their own bank account, that bank does the same thing. It keeps a fraction and lends the rest again, and again, and again. One original deposit, $1,000, circulating through the system, being lent and relent, until it is theoretically generated somewhere between 5 and 10 times the original value in total credit. This is called fractional reserve banking. It is over 300 years old, and it is the engine underneath everything. Now, before you start feeling betrayed, understand this. The system was not designed to deceive you. It was designed to solve a very real problem. In the 1600s, goldsmiths in England started doing something clever. People would deposit their gold with them for safekeeping, and the goldsmiths would issue paper receipts. Those receipts started being traded as payment. People figured out you did not need to carry the actual gold. You could just hand over the paper. The goldsmiths noticed something else. Not everyone came back for their gold at the same time. So they started quietly lending gold they were holding for other people and charging interest on it. It worked until it did not. Until too many people showed up at once. That collapse scenario, everybody wanted their money back simultaneously, became known as a bank run, and it is the oldest, most primal fear baked into the financial system. It is why that ratio matters. It is why central banks exist. It is why terms like liquidity and solvency get whispered in very serious rooms during very bad times. The 10:1 rule is not just a lending strategy. It is the tightrope every major financial institution walks every single day. So let's make this tangible because the numbers are where this gets genuinely hard to sit with. The Federal Reserve stopped requiring reserve minimums in March of 2020. You can look that up. They eliminated the reserve requirement entirely, citing the belief that other regulatory mechanisms were sufficient. Banks still hold reserves voluntarily and are subject to capital requirements, but the symbolic shift matters. For decades, 10% was a floor, the rule, the line in the sand. Now the floor is technically zero. That does not mean banks are lending out every penny with nothing behind them. Capital requirements under frameworks like Basel III are more sophisticated than a simple reserve ratio. But the average person does not know what Basel III is. The average person thinks their money is in the vault. The gap between what people believe and how the system actually functions is enormous. And that gap is where risk lives. Let us talk about what happens when the ratio breaks. 2008. By the mid-2000s, banks and financial institutions had layered leverage on top of leverage. Mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, products built on products, each one representing a claim on something that was itself already a claim on something else. At the peak of the crisis, some investment banks were operating at leverage ratios not 10-1, but closer to 30-1, or even 40-1. Lehman Brothers, when it collapsed in September 2008, had assets on its books of roughly $691 billion against equity of around $22 billion. That is a leverage ratio of more than 30-1. $30 of obligation for every $1 of cushion, when the underlying assets, the mortgages, started failing, there was no room, no buffer. The math did not care about the confidence. It did not care about the models. It did not care that very smart people had decided the risks were managed. The system did not bend. It snapped. And ordinary people who had never heard of a collateralized debt obligation watched their retirement accounts lose 40% in a year. Here is the irony that people rarely sit with. The same mechanism that caused the collapse is the same mechanism that built the prosperity that preceded it. The leverage that nearly destroyed the global economy in 2008 was the same leverage that funded the businesses, the mortgages, the expansions, the entire economic growth of the decades before. You cannot have the upside without the potential for the downside. The 10:1 rule is not a flaw in the system. It is the feature and the bug simultaneously. Banks create money through lending, not printing, not counterfeiting. Lending. When a bank approves a mortgage, it is not reaching into a pile of deposits and handing them over. It is, in a very real accounting sense, creating new money by crediting your account and recording a corresponding liability. The money did not exist before the loan. It exists now, and it will cease to exist in an accounting sense when you pay it back. This is not a secret. Central banks explain this in their own publications. The Bank of England published a paper in 2014 titled, in plain language, that most money in the modern economy is created by commercial banks making loans. It sat in their quarterly bulletin, largely unread by the general public, describing something that rewrites the common understanding of what money actually is. So where does this leave us right now? Global debt, as of recent estimates, stands at somewhere around $315 trillion. Global GDP, the total value of everything produced on Earth in a year, is roughly $105 trillion. That is a 3-to-1 ratio of debt to actual economic output. $3 of obligation for every $1 of real productive activity. And that number has been climbing for decades. Not because governments are reckless, though sometimes they are. Not because banks are corrupt, though sometimes they are. But because the system is structurally designed to expand credit. It rewards lending. It rewards leverage. It is, at its core, a machine that creates claims on future value, and then bets that future value will arrive on schedule. Usually it does. The question that serious economists argue about in journals that nobody reads is, what happens when it does not? Not a localized crisis. Not one country or one sector. A broader reckoning with what happens when accumulated leverage across the entire global system meets a world that grows slower than the debt stacked on top of it. Japan is the cautionary exhibit. In the early 1990s, Japan's asset bubble collapsed. Real estate and stock values that had been inflated by cheap credit came crashing down. The government responded by spending, then spending more. Interest rates went to zero, then stayed there. For decades, Japan's debt to GDP ratio is now over 260%. They have not collapsed. They have not defaulted. They have also not really grown. For 30 years, they have been managing a slow, careful, financially sophisticated kind of stagnation. Some economists call it trap. Others call it template. A preview of what happens when you use debt to paper over a structural problem, and the bill just keeps getting deferred. The 10:1 rule, when it runs long enough, does not always end in a dramatic crash. Sometimes it ends in a very long, very quiet diminishment. The math does not always explode. Sometimes it just slowly hollows things out. So here is where this lands. The system works because people believe it works. That sounds flippant. It is not. Confidence is not cosmetic in finance. It is load-bearing. The entire architecture of modern credit rests on the collective belief that the claims are real, that the money will be there, that the future will pay for what the present has borrowed. And for most of modern economic history, that belief has been rewarded. But belief is not a balance sheet. And leverage, at whatever ratio, is just a multiplier. It multiplies gains. It multiplies losses. It multiplies the consequences of being wrong at the worst possible moment. The 10:1 rule is not sinister. It is not a conspiracy. It is not even a mistake. It is just the terms of the deal. The terms that every person with a bank account has quietly agreed to without ever being shown the contract. The question worth sitting with is not whether the system will last. The question is whether you actually understand what you are inside of, because there is a difference between trusting something and understanding it. And in finance, that difference tends to show up at the worst possible time.